Okay, so today we're diving into something I'm sure a lot of you remember. Those $1,400 stimulus checks that hit a lot of bank accounts back in 2021.
Yeah, the good old EIP3s, right?
Exactly. Officially economic impact payments.
Mm,
But stimulus checks definitely has a better ring to it.
for sure.
These were a big part of the American Rescue Plan Act, signed by President Biden back in March 2021.
Yep, March 11th, 2021, to be exact.
And they were meant to, well, stimulate the economy, right? Pump some money into people's pockets during the heart of the COVID pandemic.
Exactly. A lot of folks were struggling, jobs were uncertain, businesses were shutting down, so the government stepped in with these direct payments to try to, well, keep things afloat.
Right, and it was a huge deal, billions of dollars going out the door.
Oh yeah, massive undertaking, a lot of moving parts.
So we're going to try to break it all down for you in this deep dive. We've gone through mountains of information, reports, articles, you name it.
We've done the homework so you don't have to.
Exactly. And our mission here is to really cut through the noise and focus on what matters most to you guys. Who is eligible for these checks? How do they get distributed? And what was the overall impact?
Right, the nitty-gritty, the stuff that actually affected people's lives.
So let's start with the basics. Who actually qualified for this money? It wasn't just free money for everyone, was it?
Nope, not at all. It was mainly based on your income, your adjusted gross income, or AGI, from your taxes.
Right, your AGI. So for those of you who filed as single, what was the income limit?
So for single filers, to get the full $1,400, your AGI had to be $75,000 or less.
Okay, so $75,000 or less for the full amount. What if you earned a bit more than that?
Well, then the payment started phasing out. So between $75,000 and $80,000 of AGI, you got a smaller
A
amount.
partial payment,
Yeah.
right?
And then once you hit $80,000 of AGI, you were out of luck. No stimulus check for you.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about those of you who filed jointly as married couples?
For married couples filing jointly, the income limits were basically doubled. So the full $2,800 went to couples with an AGI of $150,000 or less.
Got it. So $150,000 or less for the full $2,800.
Exactly. And then, just like with single filers, the payment phased out between $150,000 and $160,000 AGI.
And after $160,000, no check.
That's right. No stimulus for those higher earners.
Okay, so single filers, married couples. What about those who filed as head of household?
Yeah, good point. For head of household filers, the full $1,400 went to those with AGIs up to $112,500.
$112,500.
And you guessed it. That phased out between $112,500, $500, and $520,000.
Exactly. So those were the income limits, the main gatekeepers for who qualified for this money.
Right, so your income played a big role. But there was another big change this time around, right? Something about dependents.
Oh yeah, this was a big one. Unlike the earlier stimulus checks, this time all dependents qualified for an extra $1,400.
All dependents. That's a big change from the previous rounds. Huge difference. It wasn't just kids under 17 anymore. This included college students, adult children with disabilities, even elderly relatives.
Wow, so basically anyone you claimed as a dependent on your taxes, bam, an extra $1,400.
That's right. So, for example, a family with two college-age kids, that's an extra $2,800 on top of the parents' payment.
Yeah, that definitely adds up. So this must have been a big deal for families with older dependents.
Absolutely. Think about it. You're supporting a college student or an adult child who can't work. That extra money could have made a real difference.
Right, a lot of people overlook that detail, but it had a real impact on folks' lives.
For sure. And it shows how this round of stimulus was broader, more inclusive than the previous ones.
Okay, so we've covered who qualified based on income and dependence. Now, what about those of you who don't usually file taxes? Were you just out of luck?
Well, the good news is that certain groups who don't normally file were automatically eligible.
Oh, that's good to hear. Who are we talking about here?
People who receive Social Security benefits, SSDI, SSI, Veterans Affairs benefits, or railroad retirement benefits.
Got it. So if you were already receiving those government benefits, you didn't have to do anything special.
Exactly. The IRS already had your information, so they just sent the payment automatically.
Smart move, using those existing channels.
Definitely streamlined the process for those folks.
But what about those who didn't fall into those categories and weren't required to file taxes? How could they get their stimulus money?
Well, for those individuals, the IRS had this thing called the non-filer tool.
The non-filer tool, what was that
It
exactly?
was an online portal where people who didn't file a tax return for 2019 or 2020 could provide their information to the IRS.
Okay, so basically a way for non-filers to get on the IRS's radar and say, hey, I'm here, send me my money.
Pretty much. It was a crucial way to make sure everyone who was eligible had a chance to get their payment.
Right, because not everyone files taxes for various reasons.
Exactly. And we should also mention another group that benefited from expanded eligibility: mixed status families.
Oh, right. I remember this was a big issue during the first round of stimulus checks.
Huge issue. Back then, families with one undocumented immigrant and one U.S. citizen were completely excluded.
Yeah, a lot of controversy around that.
Definitely. But the American Rescue Plan changed that. This time, those families were eligible, as long as at least one spouse had a Social Security number.
So a big step towards inclusivity there.
Absolutely. Recognizing the reality of these families and making sure they weren't left out.
Okay, so now we have a pretty good idea of who qualified for this money, but how did those payments actually reach people? How did the government distribute this massive amount of cash?
So there were three main ways the IRS sent out the payments. The fastest and probably the way most people got their money was direct deposit.
Direct deposit makes sense, easy, efficient.
Yeah, if the IRS had your bank info from a previous tax return, they just zapped the money straight to your account.
And how quickly did that happen?
Really quickly, actually. Millions of payments were processed within days of the law being signed in mid-March 2021.
Wow, that's impressive speed.
Definitely. The IRS was working overtime to get that money out the door as fast as possible.
Right, because people were in dire need.
Absolutely. But of course, not everyone had direct deposit set up with the IRS.
So what happened in those cases?
For those folks, the IRS mailed out paper checks.
Ah, the old-fashioned way.
Yep. But as you can imagine, that took a lot longer.
Yeah, snail mail is definitely not as fast as digital transfers.
For sure. It could take weeks for those checks to arrive, depending on where you lived and how backed up the postal service was.
And I vaguely recall some people getting a debit card, too.
You're right. Some people got their payment on an EIP prepaid debit card.
EIP debit card. Tell me more about that.
These cards were issued by a bank called MetaBank, working on behalf of the Treasury Department.
Interesting. So basically, you got this debit card loaded with your stimulus amount.
Exactly. You could use it like a regular debit card, make purchases, withdraw cash from ATMs.
So the IRS tried to cover all the bases, different methods for different people.
Yeah, they wanted to make sure everyone had a way to access their money, even if they didn't have a bank account.
Right, because not everyone is plugged into the traditional banking system.
For sure. And speaking of accessing your money, the IRS had this handy tool for tracking your payment.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that. What was it called again?
It was called Get My Payment.
Get My Payment. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, very descriptive. You could go on the IRS website, plug in your info, and see the status of your payment.
So you could see if it had been processed, when it was sent, how it was being delivered, all that good stuff.
Exactly. Gave people some peace of mind, knowing where their money was and when they could expect it.
And what if something went wrong? What if your payment got lost or never showed up?
Good question. If your payment went MIA, you could request a payment trace from the IRS.
A payment trace. What's that?
It's basically an investigation into the whereabouts of your payment. The IRS would try to figure out what happened, and if it was confirmed lost, they could reissue it.
Okay, so there were some safeguards in place if things went sideways.
Right. They tried to have a system to catch those errors and make sure everyone got what they were entitled to.
Now let's move on to something that always causes confusion. Taxes. How did these stimulus payments affect people's taxes?
This is a super important point. The stimulus payments were not taxable income.
Okay, so you didn't have to report that money on your tax return.
Nope, not at all. It was considered tax-free.
That's a big relief because I'm sure some people were worried about having to pay some of it back at tax time.
Yeah, that would defeat the whole purpose of stimulus, wouldn't it?
Totally. So no matter how much you got, it was all yours to keep, no tax implications.
Exactly. The government wanted this money to go directly into people's pockets, no strings attached.
But what if your income in 2021 ended up being higher than the eligibility limits? Did you have to pay back any of the stimulus money?
Generally, no. If you received a payment based on your 2019 or 2020 income, you didn't have to pay it back, even if you earned more in 2021.
Okay, so even if you later technically wouldn't have qualified based on your 2021 income, you didn't have to return the money.
That's right. It was about providing immediate relief, not creating a future tax headache.
Makes sense. But what if your situation changed in 2021, like you had a baby, or the IRS didn't have your most up-to-date income info? Could you still get the full amount you were entitled to?
Absolutely. If you were eligible for a larger payment than what you received, you could claim the difference as the Recovery Rebate Credit, or RRC, on your 2021 tax return.
The Recovery Rebate Credit, or RRC. So this was basically a way to catch any discrepancies and make sure everyone got the right amount.
Exactly. It acted as a safety net, especially for people whose situations changed during 2021.
Right, because life doesn't stand still just because there's a pandemic going on.
For sure. People have babies, lose jobs, their income fluctuates. The RRC was there to account for those real-life changes.
Okay, so we've covered who qualified, how the payments were distributed, and the tax implications. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. What kind of impact did these $1,400 checks have on the economy as a whole?
Well, one of the most immediate effects was a big boost in consumer spending.
People got their checks and went shopping.
Pretty much. A lot of that money went towards essential needs. Rent, groceries, utilities, things people were struggling to afford.
Right, those basic necessities.
Exactly. And that spending had a ripple effect, helping to keep businesses afloat, especially small businesses that were hit hard by the pandemic.
So it wasn't just individuals who benefited, it was also the businesses they were patronizing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about essentials. Some people also used the money for non-essential spending, things like electronics, clothes, entertainment.
So a bit of a splurge, too.
You could say that, and that also helped to stimulate demand and get the economy moving again.
And I remember hearing a lot about the potential for these payments to reduce poverty. Did that actually happen?
Yeah, there's evidence to suggest that it did. Studies showed that the stimulus checks played a significant role in reducing poverty rates, particularly for households earning under $50,000.
So that money provided a crucial safety net for those who were most vulnerable.
Exactly. It helped to prevent people from falling deeper into poverty during a really tough time.
And what about the job market? Did the stimulus have any effect on job growth?
It's hard to say for sure, but there's a good chance it did. As consumer spending increased, businesses needed to hire more workers to meet that demand.
Makes sense. More customers, more business, more need for employees.
Right. So the stimulus might have played a role in the job market recovery that was happening around that time.
Interesting. Were there any other notable economic effects?
Well, some data suggested a decrease in household debt. People used the money to pay down credit cards, student loans, even mortgages.
So improving their overall financial well-being.
Exactly. That extra cash gave them some breathing room to tackle their debt.
But of course, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. I remember a lot of talk about inflation around that time. Did the stimulus contribute to that?
That's a tough question. It's a complex issue with a lot of contributing factors.
Right. It's not a simple cause and effect situation.
Definitely not. But some economists argue that the massive amount of government spending, including the stimulus checks, did contribute to the inflation we saw in 2021 and 2022.
So basically, more money in circulation, more demand, and with supply chains still messed up from the pandemic, prices went up.
That's the general idea. But it's important to note that this is still a subject of debate among economists. There's no clear consensus on the exact role of the stimulus in driving inflation.
Right. It's a nuanced issue.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And it's worth remembering that inflation was already starting to tick up before the stimulus checks went out.
Okay, so while the stimulus might have had some inflationary effects, it's hard to say for sure how much.
Yeah, disentangling all the factors is tricky.
Now, let's talk about some of the challenges people faced in actually getting those $1,400 payments. It wasn't always smooth sailing, was it?
Unfortunately not. Despite the IRS's best efforts, there were some common issues that popped up.
Like what?
Well, a big one was delays in receiving payments. Some people had to wait weeks, even months, for their money to arrive.
Oh, that must have been frustrating.
Incredibly frustrating, especially if you were relying on that money to pay bills or put food on the table.
What caused those delays?
Various reasons, actually. Could be simple things like a typo in your bank account number or a wrong address on file with the IRS.
Those little administrative errors can really mess things up.
They sure can. But there were also bigger backlogs in processing at the IRS, just due to the sheer volume of payments they were handling.
Right. They were dealing with a massive influx of requests.
It was an unprecedented situation, so there were bound to be some hiccups along the way.
And I imagine some people received the wrong amount, too.
Yeah, that happens sometimes. Some folks got less than they should have, while others might have gotten more.
How did those errors happen?
Well, dependents might have been missed in the initial calculations, or income might have been miscalculated based on old tax information.
And then there were probably just general processing errors, too, right?
Oh yeah, with a system that complex, mistakes are bound to happen.
And what about those who just never received a payment at all? What were the main challenges there?
For those missing payments, it often came down to being a non-filer or having outdated information with the IRS.
So if you hadn't filed taxes recently, or if your address had changed, the IRS might not have been able to track you down.
Exactly. And in those cases, the IRS often advised people to file a 2021 tax return.
As a way to claim their missing stimulus money through that recovery rebate credit we talked about earlier.
Right, the RSC was kind of a catch-all solution for those who slipped through the cracks.
Okay, so while the intention was good, the execution wasn't always perfect. Lots of logistical challenges in getting that money to everyone who deserved it.
For sure. It was a massive undertaking, and despite the bumps in the road, I think it ultimately helped a lot of people.
So to sum it all up, these $1,400 stimulus checks were a big deal. They provided a lifeline for individuals and families struggling during the pandemic, and they likely had a significant impact on the broader economy.
No doubt about it. They were a key part of the government's response to the crisis, and they definitely play a role in shaping the recovery.
But as we've discussed, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were challenges in distribution, questions about the long-term economic effects, and of course the whole inflation debate.
Right, it's a complex topic with a lot of different angles.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you all to consider. Looking back at this massive economic intervention, what do you think are the key lessons learned about the effectiveness and the challenges of providing direct financial assistance during a crisis? What should policymakers keep in mind if they ever have to do something like this again?
It's definitely worth pondering because who knows, we might face another situation in the future where these kinds of direct payments are considered.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
So yeah.
Bye.